Okay, so this is the last lecture, and this is meant to be an inspiration for those who might be interested in working on this in other contexts. Basically, it's about using the labor market and search friction paradigm to think about macroeconomic issues, because in a sense, this is kind of a course about macroeconomic phenomena, and I tried to inspire that by showing you this picture last time. Remember this? This is theta. This is not the theta from the model that we looked at with prejudice discrimination, but rather this is the good old-fashioned Pissarides theta. So it's the ratio of the stock of vacancies to the stock of unemployed people in the United States, and the same picture is available for Germany. I didn't plot it just to save you the data are not so good. They don't go back far enough. They go back to about 2008 or 9, but they show a similar strong cyclical attribute. It's kind of a leading indicator, so it's a good predictor for business cycle. This thing is going up. Labor markets are getting tight. Wages will rise in real terms, and employers will complain about not finding workers. So that's kind of interesting. So what I'd like to spend today talking about is just different ways to explain the fluctuations, the cyclical attributes of theta, but also the volatility of theta. So theta is obviously very volatile. It moves a lot compared to other variables in the data, like the wage, the real wage, and even other prices, relative prices. So this is maybe an indication that the search and matching model in general is challenged. If it wants to have any sort of footprint on macroeconomics, it really has to be able to explain this. So I'd like to give you some approaches that have been used. So most of you are in macro. You're taking the macro IAMA course. Some of you are taking maybe Lutzweinke's course. And I think I'd like to make the argument that this approach has really has infiltrated macro. So it's used quite a bit. It's even used by people not looking at labor markets, but looking at search and matching in the capital markets, for example. So it's a useful paradigm. Okay, so just to finish up, we talked about last time. There's some other things you can talk about, which we won't talk about in this course or didn't talk about in this course, but you should be aware. You can think about posting a contract instead of posting just a wage. There was a small literature around that idea. There's also the idea of having firms with many workers, and then the marginal firm has to deal with the fact that the fallback for the firm is not to hire the worker because it already has some workers. So it's the workers' bargaining power is not so great. And that kind of inspires a lot of people to think, well, this is really where it's at. We shouldn't have a one man, one firm, one woman, one firm. We should actually have a large firm and a small worker. And that's why workers like to organize and get some pushback. There's a very interesting literature around the way wage bargaining actually occurs. So a lot of times there's as you remember from the search model, there was this idea of you could get the offer and then you could accept it and leave the firm or leave the relationship for a higher wage, or you could just ignore it. Well, there are models that allow you to make a counteroffer. So you can say, look, boss, I got this offer. What are you going to do about it? And you can have some sort of internal negotiation in the firm. And it's just kind of confirming. And I wanted to remind you, this is one of my favorite tricks on the exam is to ask a question that has nothing to do with labor markets. So just to show you that this is appropriate, the model is appropriate for lots of things, like finding a parking space in Berlin in a car. There's a vacancy and there's an unemployed sort of unparked car, and or you're looking for an apartment, or you're at a club looking for some interesting people to get to know. These are all things that we have search and matching. So it's just examples, and there are many other examples that you can imagine. And I want you to keep that in mind. So I'll start by talking about the business cycle model in general. I'm a big fan of the real business cycle as a way of thinking about economics, macroeconomics, but I'm I'm of course aware that there are many failures of this model, and that's why the new Keynesian model has such traction, is because we think that money matters and credit matters and monetary policy matters. Still, the real business cycle model has a better chance if you introduce search and matching. So if you allow frictions in the labor market to show up and to translate into frictions in other markets, or to transmit their problems to other markets, like the product market. And I'd like to remind you that about 20 years ago, these guys wrote a paper appealing to the methodology, which is true. I mean, if you use the new Keynesian approach, which is quite viable and practical, many of the devices that came from the real business cycle literature arose through this idea of dynamic optimization and applying rational expectations and paying attention to relative prices and taxes and things like that. So I'd like to start by talking about, briefly, about a paper that was very influential, parallel paper by Monika Merz, who's from Germany actually. She's currently at the University of Vienna, about the same time. So they both had a simultaneous idea. He got a little bit more attention because he got his paper in the AER, but her paper was in the JME, which is a pretty good contender, and it appeared a year before his. So the question is, whose idea was it? And it's a classic problem in macro, in science in general, is people sometimes don't get credit for what they do. So I'm giving a little bit of credit to both of them. Think of this as the Merz and Andolfatto idea. So it's like taking the RBC model that I teach in the introduction to advanced macroeconomic theory, and then just adding a labor market to it. Because we never talk about labor. We talk about it sort of as if labor was supplied by households in a perfectly unencumbered way, without any frictions. And that's probably not a very good description of reality, but the question is that important? Does it matter? Because reality is not the prime criterion for a good model. It's really, does the model have predictive power as a result of having this additional feature that looks realistic? I'll go on to talk about a paper that I wrote myself with my first doctoral student who is currently at Aarhus, and basically we had a similar idea using the search and matching framework. And before I do that, I'm going to talk about Pissarides, because Pissarides is the kind of the father of this way of thinking. Got the Nobel Prize, and his paper with Mortensen you can work with, you're familiar with, and there's also his original papers where there was no fluctuation in the separation rate is enough to show what the problem is with the reason why the search and matching paradigm is interesting is that it can actually introduce a certain rigidity in the wage that we want to make things work for us. And I'll use the paper with Mark to show how that worked, Mark Vader. Okay, so just to remind you, and again, this is not going to be on the exam in the sense of being a question that I could talk about, but it's certainly making you aware of being able to apply the ideas we learned, right? So this is the idea, the importance of wage determination, for example. So I should say something about the exam. I forgot. Okay, so if you watch the videos on the internet, you'll see that I talk about this. So there's kind of and Thomas will talk about this in detail. I think there's going to be a mock exam or something like that, or at least he'll show you how the exam is structured. There's a section that basically involves evaluating a statement, whether it's true, false, or uncertain, and if it's false or uncertain, you have to say in one or two sentences why. Okay, so that's a fairly straightforward exercise. And then there's an exercise generally involving some manipulation of this Pissarides model. Okay, so being able to play with that is that's an essential tool, understanding how that thing fits together, the parts fit together. And then, of course, deriving the reservation wage. Okay, so that's I'm just telling you pretty much what's going to be on the exam, but go to the review section this week, and Thomas will give you more details. And I understand the attendance is also better at Thomas's section, which is a good sign. So these are not ghosts, these are real people who are and I told you already that so we've written the exam already, so it's already been decided. There are 2 different versions, and we just choose one randomly, and that's the way it works. So go to the review session or the tutorial session to get details on that. Okay, so back to the subject. Real business cycles, the idea is simply how important is money and credit in driving the business cycle. And there's this lagging doubt that a lot of the big business cycle developments have little to do with monetary policy per se, but rather with real phenomena. So in some sense, the financial crisis was kind of a non-monetary event. It was driven by a credit boom, real estate around the world, especially in the United States, and the system of money and credit drying up. So you could say that's kind of monetary, but it's not monetary in the sense of cutting interest rates, inflating the economy, raising interest rates, causing the economy to crash. You have to be a more sophisticated approach. But more generally, there's a lot of evidence that things like the real price of energy matters for the business cycle. So the current situation is a good example of that, but also the 1970s dual oil price increases that everyone talks about as the paradigmatic supply shock of the economy. That's a great example, and it's just one example. Hamilton has shown that many business cycles are associated with sudden movements of the relative price of energy, the price of oil, and it goes in the other direction too. So if in years when the price of oil in terms of other goods has dropped, the economy has really taken off, right? And when that corrects, maybe the economy will correct as well. So there's a good view of the RBC. The only problem is the labor market. I mean, the labor market doesn't work very well in the RBC model because we assume that this representative stand-in household is basically unconstrained. There is no if there's any unemployment in that model, it's because the household wants to take a break. The household wants leisure, maybe because the wage is low relative to the standard level, or the household is feeling kind of rich temporarily, so it takes a little bit of a break. Or maybe in these papers, Kidler and Prescott, if a household works a lot for successive periods, it kind of gets tired of working and wants to take some leisure. So it's something that we don't really think characterizes unemployment, but you could make the argument, and these guys, rest in peace, Ed Prescott made that argument very seriously. Kidler, a little bit less so maybe, but and there are students, other people. You can think of King and Rebelo as and their 1999 paper, and they've written some stuff since then. It's kind of, it's still, the method is very important. And people have worked on many different ways of trying to make this work, especially the wage, because the wage in the data is rather sticky, and it doesn't move very much, the aggregate wage. And the quantities move a lot. So that sounds a little bit like the Scheimer puzzle, right? So that's the idea, is that somehow maybe the search and matching paradigm might be an alternative way to these papers as a way of getting the wage to be rigid and to make GDP and vacancies and unemployment move a lot more, quantities, because that's what we see in the data. I'll show that in a second. Okay, so the challenge, of course, as you know, goes way back. The idea is trying to say that these business cycles are recurring, so it can't be like mankind is too stupid to fix it. You know, maybe some sort of reaction to things that we just can't do better than, because we've had business cycles since industrialization. You know, it's a pretty well-known fact, and the volatility hasn't gone down as much as it should have had this been such a big issue, like we really have to do something about it. So it has gone down somewhat because maybe the world is becoming more service sector oriented. There's less of a capital stock inventory type of music in the cycle. It's more just hiring and firing people. And of course we have this Slutsky notion of shocks hitting the economy all the time, and this is just a way of dealing with it. And I've always found that to be very convincing, because if the idea behind socialism was kind of to use central planning as a way of stopping this from happening, and even in socialist economies there are cycles. So, half socialist economies have business cycles as well, and it's really a real puzzle. So, go back to the challenge. Can we just think of this as an equilibrium, and people know this is going to recurrently happen, and firms and households try to deal with this in a rational way? So it's just one challenge. And of course, the most important thing for me is that economics, regardless of your ideology, has to respect certain facts. One thing is, if you eat a lot of stuff today, you're not going to have much capital tomorrow. If you save a lot, you'll have more productive facilities tomorrow, and you'll be eating less today. So it's always this trade-off. And if suddenly the production function is more expansive and more adequate to accommodate those needs, then you can do both. You can have a little bit of investment, and extra investment, and you can also have a little bit more consumption, but it has to make sense in some sense. You're not going to just do this randomly. So this model is driven by the idea that there are these persistent movements in the production possibilities frontier that agents that are smart take into account. And these are systematic things. Like, it's not just, I get a new job, but the whole economy is somehow more productive, macro. Now, it doesn't really work that well. So the reason why we have other models, the reason I teach the new Keynesian approach, is because there's some failures, of course, but there's some pretty good successes. Right? So, but we have to be honest. You always have to highlight the problems. It's hard in these models to get the aggregate wage to behave properly, because in a boom, the wage rises, workers are more productive. Why? Workers are not individually very elastic. Some workers join the labor force, but we do see this expansive reaction of labor, which is consistent at the individual micro level with a high elasticity of substitution, intertemporal substitution, but it's not consistent with micro evidence. So it's either the extensive margin, or people are really unemployed involuntarily. And that's where the search and matching comes through, comes in as a possible explanation. So if you're involuntarily employed, sort of, because you have a reservation wage that's kind of higher than the average stuff that's lying on the street, so you're kind of holding back. That's kind of something we've learned about, right? Also, you could just think of Pizzaritti's model. The wages, there's no reservation wage in that model. It's a Nash bargained outcome of identical people meeting in this labor market. And you can fine-tune the reactivity or the sensitivity of that Nash bargained wage by doing things with the fallback positions, or we'll show you in a second, you can play other games with the way the wage is determined. You don't have to use Nash bargaining. You could have some sort of other wage bargaining, or you could have wage bargaining for a subset of workers, not for all. Okay, so the fundamental problem with the RBC model was always that it didn't give a lot of persistence of output or output growth, and it didn't have really an endogenous propagation mechanism. So this is the biggest complaint. And if you just shock these models with a technology shock, the cycle is worked out fairly quickly. We don't have this sort of long reaction, and we don't have the hump. It's hard to get the hump into the system. So at the same time, we like it because it's intellectually clear, right? I mean, if you're a smart, above average macro student, you understand this pretty well, because all the working parts are understandable. I'm not hand waving. It's all about budget constraints, resource constraints, reaction of agents in a time consistent, optimal way, given their goals. Okay, so, and the RBC model can account for stuff. Okay, if you have the right model parameters, and most importantly, it does account for things that we do observe in the data. Productivity is very pro-cyclical in most countries. Okay, average labor productivity. In the most recent pandemic, it's kind of tricky because a lot of people stayed home and productivity went up. So there was kind of a recession and productivity went up. So it doesn't sound like, so the world doesn't work on a single type of model. There must be an alternative reason that labor could not work, and that's because a labor supply shock might be there. Okay, so you don't want to shoot down the model just because of a pandemic, but you need to be clever enough to account for that as well. If you just look at the raw data without the pandemic, you get pro-cyclical productivity, and this is just an example, right? It's very cyclical. At the same time, wages are not that cyclical. So this is the nominal wage in the Burns-Mitchell diagram. You see there's nothing. The dominant feature is the nominal wage is growing, and it grows at pretty much the same rate across the peak of the business cycle. So it's almost like it's not doing much at all. If you just look at one country, this is probably Germany. Now this is the average of 8 countries. And then if you take, yeah, right. So if you just look at that, you see wages are kind of not reacting very much. And maybe they're bound by something, maybe they're bound in contracts, so that's kind of one trick, is to put in some contracts. Calvo pricing, Calvo model. And this is for nominal wages, but you can, that's the whole point. If nominal wages are kind of not reacting very much, then real wages will react more, and maybe there's some music in that idea. Now, remember the wage times the employment over the period is the wage bill. That's the amount of money firms pay to labor. And if you divide that by GDP, that's the wage share, the labor share. So that's a really interesting indicator. It's one of my favorites. Because, I mean, if you just do the simple math, it's really simple, right? W times L divided by P times Y. That's kind of a measure of the share of GDP, because this is value-added GDP. This is the share of wages as measured as employee cost to the employer, including Social Security contributions, everything, divided by value-added, that the workers have contributed to, but not exclusively. So what is this number in Germany? Anybody have a guess? It always depends. I mean, people don't measure it properly. You have to really go into the GDP, the Volkswirtschaftliche Gesamtrechnung, and look up Arbeitnehmerentgelte. This is all payments, all compensation to employees, okay? Including, you don't ever see it, it goes to the Social Security system, including the stuff that your employer pays. That's your true labor costs, okay? And this is GDP. Y is the quantity, and P is the price of GDP, price index. So it's an inner product of many prices and many quantities. Okay, so this is, what do you think this number is in Germany? High? High? Yeah, but it can't be greater than 1, and it can't be less than 0. 0.7. Okay, it's actually high for Germany.
It's even higher than 0.7?
No, it's lower.
It's low.
Yeah.
0.7 is a very high number.
Yeah, but it's not unusual. So if you go back to the 70s, it was higher than 0.7 in a lot of European countries. But it's cyclical. Cobb-Douglas, the Cobb-Douglas analysis would say that it's constant. It's not constant. It's a violation of the Cobb-Douglas assumption, right?
Declining?
It's been declining since the financial crisis, but it's come up again. It started to rise even before the pandemic. Well, I'll show you. Yeah, exactly. So that's where we're going. And the question is, how can you get a macro model to tell you that? That's the question. But just look at this. All right. So in the United States, this is like 2/3, but now also a bit less. It's been trending downward. In Germany, it's more like 0.6. Maybe last time I looked, it was about 0.6. It's been rising. So what generates the cyclicality? Well, just crudely, I do this for my undergraduates. You've seen this before. Trivially, this is the ratio of the real wage properly measured in terms of the product wage So it's the worker's wage costs per hour or per day or per year divided by the appropriate deflator, which is the price of the goods that the worker has contributed to, not the price of oil. If Germany doesn't make any oil, or refine any oil, or make any gasoline, this P will not include the price of gasoline, even though it matters to you. So it's a different real wage. But the real product wage relative to productivity is the same thing as the wage share, taken as an aggregate. Okay, so really, the cyclical question is what happens over the cycle? Does this one go up faster than this one, or does it go up slowly? And if wages are rigid, then all the music is playing in productivity, and we know productivity is pro-cyclical. So that means the wage share should actually be counter-cyclical. It declines in booms, but it rises in recessions. Don't forget the other one. Because the wage share is actually kind of stable. It's stationary, despite what many economists have claimed. I mean, you know, there's a big discussion about capital in the 21st century. It's about the distribution of GDP between capital and labor. Well, for a long time, Piketty was saying that this is falling secularly. It's actually not so true. It's turned the corner. In developing countries, it's rising. And in industrial countries, it's stabilizing. And it has to do this. If workers' wages don't fall with falling rates of productivity growth, then the wage share has to rise. So I urge you all to go to Fred and take a look at it for your favorite country. It's really an interesting exercise. And of course, there's always measurement issues. How do you measure? What happens if people are becoming contractors? If the company fires them and hires them back as a contractor, then it's an input. They're not employees anymore. They're employing themselves. So the capital share actually rises. The capital share is the complement of the wage labor share. So when this goes down, the other one goes up. And if you become a capitalist working for yourself, you know, you think you're still a worker, but you're kind of signing a contract with the employer. It's a different time. So that's the trend you have to worry about. If workers are being faked into a capitalist type of mode, even though they're still doing the same thing, it's not. You have to check that, because it's kind of the firm is trying to get around paying taxes or paying Social Security contributions. So this is the issue I'm trying to get at is the relationship with these two guys. Okay, and if you think nominal and real wages are rather smooth compared to productivity, that means you're probably going to have a counter-cyclical wage share. Okay, and that's kind of what you have, because this is the wage share in the Burns-Mitchell, and you see that a lot of these wage shares are actually falling around the cycle or right before the cycle. And if you look, and they rise in the recession because productivity falls faster than the wage. Okay, so here's a good example. This is the wage share for the 7 countries that are interesting to me. Okay, so the ones that we had really long data on cycles. This is an old picture, but it's the same. You can see that around the cycle, the wage share rises. Okay, so that gives you a hint. Maybe what we need to do is build a model where the real wage doesn't move as much as productivity, and productivity is pro-cyclical. It's kind of what, but again, there's no single explanation for the cycle, but there are a few good models out there. One says it's about productivity, one says it's about monetary policy, and one says it's about financial irregularities or sort of the boom and bust of lending, bank behavior, et cetera. Okay, so again, I'm just trying to inspire you a little bit. Here's the U.S. economy. These are the volatilities. This is from Andolfatto's paper. This is still true today. Although wages are less, or the wage share is maybe behaving a little bit differently. In any case, productivity is not as pro-cyclical as it used to be. Jordi Gali has shown that. So productivity used to be extremely pro-cyclical in the United States, and that's what inspired Prescott and Kydland to write these papers. But now we see that since 1990, about productivity is kind of often moving in the wrong direction. So it's actually declining in periods of the expanding economy. So it might be a different type of shock hitting. right? So could be because monetary shocks are becoming relatively more prevalent, and we need a monetary model of the cycle. But in any case, the RBC economy doesn't do very well in accounting for the volatility of these things, especially the wage bill, the labor share, the real wage, is kind of too volatile in the RBC model. So Andolfatto and Monica Meritz had this idea, let's put matching in the RBC model. What happens then? Okay, so that's a really clever idea. Really clever. And Monica Meritz was actually the PhD student of Dale Mortensen. So she's German, she went to the United States, did her PhD with Dale Mortensen at Northwestern, and then wrote this paper and came back, and we still talk about Meritz and Andolfatto. Okay, so this is so look what she did. This is taken directly from her paper. I really copied and pasted it. I didn't even bother to type it in. So she's got employment tomorrow depending on the number of workers today. Okay, and then you've got this 1 minus sigma, it's her depreciation. Sigma is her depreciation. So these are the matches that dissolve. It's like our S. Remember S? Okay, so the surviving employment is the surviving employment from last time, plus the new matches coming from vacancies and unemployment. Unemployment is what? It's employment times 1 minus the employment rate, or something like that. And the way she's doing it, I think E is a constant, and it's actually something like search effort. And 1 minus N is the unemployment rate, what we would call U. Okay? And then this is where she gets fancy. Instead of doing what we did with this sort of rinky-dink bathtub, she has a utility of the representative household. So you're in a household, you've got all these family members, and you're saying, okay, you guys, you're going to take a break, and you guys, you're going to go look for a job. And this is going to kind of mimic the behavior of the economy. And it's amazing how well she did compared to the RBC model, I think. Okay, so you've got utility over consumption, and you've got some utility over not working. Okay, and then you've got some trend, some time-dependent trend she's got in there. Anyway, the idea is just the idea that I want you to take with you. But you've got this resource constraint, so the household can't do whatever it wants. She also has capital in the model, so that's also a big plus. So you can either save in the form of capital tomorrow, or you can consume, and then you also have to pay for vacancies. So the household owns the firms that are hiring the workers that have to pay for the advertisement to get the workers in. So it's this classic sort of schizophrenic view of the world. The big household, the matriarch is planning her day, and she's got some of these microscopic members of the household that are looking for work, that are unemployed, and she has to pay, and she's also owning the firm that's trying to hire them. And this representative household has to somehow, and those are, it's 1% of GDP, maybe 0.5% of GDP is search costs in this setup. And that turns out to be a lot. I mean, I take 0.5% of Germany's GDP any day, right? So anyway, she, in the classic sort of macro mindset, she says, let's decentralize this economy and then she just kind of goes on her way, and this is exactly what Andolfatto does. So I'm taking Andolfatto's setup instead of hers because it's a bit easier to see. In macro we teach this. This is a state. This is a state of the economy. And the state is a combination of capital stock, employment, and the productivity. That's what Z is. And why is employment a state variable? Remember, state variable is something you can't change right now. You can only change it kind of tomorrow by doing something today. Employment. Employment is a state variable because they're there, and if you want to get somebody else, you have to search and match,
so
right?
They had already made their,
They've been hired already.
Yeah, exactly, yes.
And that's
decisions already,
Right, and that's kind of going to give us some extra traction, because that's also going to give us persistence in the model. Okay, so that, again, this is an old idea, but it's 1996 was a long time ago, but I was kind of excited about this model when it came out, and that's you got an initial condition, so it looks like an RBC model, and this is Andolfatto's version. So I'll just go quickly. You can do this. You can solve this or attack this problem using the Bellman equation idea that we've dealt with a million times. So there's this function, this stationary function W, which is the maximized values of utilities subject to the budget constraint given the state vector. And you get these first order conditions that are beautiful, and they look like first order conditions that we've seen before, except there are a couple of interesting things that involve wages that are not familiar to us. Okay, and there's one that involves posting of vacancies, because that's a choice variable for the household. The household can choose how much resources to put into search intensity. Okay, so just to give you an idea, and you can, again, this is highly technical. If you're interested, you can take a look at it, and if you want, you can come talk to me about it in office hours. But I just want to show you, it's got the same flavor as the RBC model. You've got this Euler equation that you can derive by taking the first order conditions and using the fact that at the optimum, the controls don't respond to a small change in the state at the optimum. So you can basically substitute and get a nice set of equations, and you get this expression for the number of new matches that are formed, and again, these imply behavior for the vacancies relative to unemployment, just like in the Pisarese model, but in response to a productivity shock. And productivity in the economy is endogenous because workers can be hired, and they can also be employment can change in response, and capital can respond in response to a productivity shock. And firms can create vacancies, and vacancies behavior can be tracked. The only trick is to decentralize this economy, because it's, again, the classic way that Andolfatto solved this problem is to think of this as a central planner's problem. Could the market replicate this outcome using the second welfare theorem? So under some hand waving, you can make that argument, and you get a vacancy condition, which looks like Pisarides. I think it's very much inspired by, and Merz has the same type of so you have kind of a, in this decentralized version of the economy, you have something like an entry condition, and you can show that the decentralized economy matches the central planner's version. The cool thing is the wage. There's a wage rule that evolves from this, and the interpretation of the wage rule is kind of tricky, because the central planner doesn't have any wages. The central planner just allocates resources, and you can read off the implicit wage by the marginal rate of substitution of labor for consumption, right? So that's one of the maybe points of tension, is can we really get away with that? But they do it, and he does it, and you can see that the wage in this decentralized economy is related to the marginal product of labor, but less something. Okay, and what it's less is a piece that's related to this the shadow value of labor in hand, because you have to get labor by hiring workers, posting vacancies. You don't have them immediately. So if productivity of labor rises, you're not going to pay. You're not going to pay the marginal product, but you also have to somehow take into account that getting that worker is also going to be costly to you. So this is just to make that transition. So he calibrates it like we do in macro, and then he simulates it, and he gets a much better fit in terms of the variances, in terms of the covariances, And you can see that the wage share is moving now, which I think is a feature of the model. In fact, I think in the standard simulation, he actually gets a negative correlation of the labor share, which is what I was telling you was a good idea, because in the straight RBC model, the labor share doesn't, it's constant. Cobb-Douglas marginal product is a constant times average product always, even if you have productivity shocks. So it's just the Cobb-Douglas, the feature of Cobb-Douglas. But in this model, you have something like a sharing arrangement. So the wage is no longer the strict marginal product. It's marginal product adjusted. So anyway, the RBC model can do better with search and matching. That's the bottom line. I'm going to try to reinforce that with my work with Mark. I'm going to show you very quickly. This is just to get you kind of excited about it. It's difficult at this time of the year. It's difficult this time of the semester. But the RBC model is really can be enhanced by adding realistic search and matching and labor markets. And I mentioned Monica Merritt's already. It's almost like having a multiple sector model, and you have the sector that creates job matches. So it's like a dating and mating sector. Right? It's just putting people together, and then, that's cool. Okay, so that's the first model. Then I want to talk about Pissarides, so the grand old daddy of, or the old granddaddy. He's not really old. He's older than me. And remember, Pissarides was the guy who brought you this equation that's on the exam, right? This first one, if you don't know this, you're in trouble, right? So, Pissarides, this is just before he got the Nobel Prize. So this is like, I think it might have been his Nobel Prize presentation in Stockholm, because I usually get invited to do a lecture. So I remember this paper. This is, and many of my students have worked on this for like seminar papers or theses. So we have the first equation, which is the classic equilibrium condition, two states, inflows and outflows. S is the inflow rate into unemployment. F is the outflow rate. And Pissarides' contribution was to endogenize F, right? And sort of take the matching function and make it into something that's alive. So even if F is moving, a lot of the action comes from F. Even if S is moving, the action is coming from F. And his original papers that we started with in this course had a fixed S. So everything was coming from F. So F goes up, U goes down. And F does go up in booms. That's a fact. Okay? But it's not the whole story. And remember, F in our vision of F, that you should know for the exam, is a function of theta, and it comes from a constant returns matching function, and theta is defined as V divided by U that I showed you at the very beginning of this lecture. Okay, so to get F to go down, what do you need? Yeah. And how do we say about that? How do we describe that in terms of theta? It's checking to see if theta goes down, right? This is also on the exam, right? What's the derivative of this function? Right? And you're all smart, you should know that, right? Is it positive or is it negative? Well, I think it's positive, right? And we call this labor market tightness. So when theta goes up, F goes up, workers are happy, and unemployment goes down. Right? That's kind of the magic of matching. It goes the other way too. So in recessions, employers are happy because Q goes up. Q is the kind of the complement of F. Remember the formula? That's also on the exam. So I'm not going to tell you the formula, but any constant returns to function, any constant returns to scale matching function gives you that magic relationship between F and Q. F goes up, workers are happy, F goes down, workers are unhappy, Q goes up, firms are happy, workers are not so happy. And that's a cyclical thing. It's also, in Germany, there's a trend. Q has been rising, and we saw in the US it's been rising, but cyclically are the most important movements. Cyclical movements are the most important movements. So the second equation is Pissarides saying, look, I'm so smart, I got this first equation right. Now I'm going to I'm going to take sort of a linearization of that and try to account for why does U change? Okay, we know that S is not constant, and if F changes a little bit, it actually has a bigger effect than the same arithmetic change that F has, because if you stare at that quotient long enough, it's the quotient of something related to something plus something else. Okay, so if S moves, a little tiny movement of S has a bigger impact than a little tiny movement of F, because F is bigger than S, a lot bigger. Trivia question. What's a good value? Okay, I'll ask you, what's a good value of S? If you just had to, and again, you always have to say quarterly data, annual data, monthly data. Well, we're probably going to think about monthly data.
So kind of layoffs in relation to.
Not just layoffs, but any separations. S stands for separation because we don't make a judgment, but it's probably a lot of layoffs. Could also be firms going out of business. It could be workers quitting. Yeah, it's small. It's super small, okay? So I'm going to guess in the United States, because I don't know, the fun fact is the relationship, okay? But if we're dealing with monthly data, it's less than 1%, okay? It's probably point, let's just try. Let's just try that one. So 0.8%. Okay, now, if we know that the stock of unemployment as a rate is about 5% in the United States, actually now it's under 4% now. Okay, what does F have to be? To make that work. If I tell you that U is about, make it easy, 4%. How big does F have to be? I'm kind of winging this, but I have a pretty good idea. Anybody? We can solve for it, right? We could S plus F times U, S, and then F equals S over U minus S, right? So what's S over U? It's this times 25. Minus what?
Minus 0.008.
So this is so small, but this is kind of more important. So it's going to be like 1902? Okay, so 20% per month of unemployed workers find a job. That has to be true if this is a steady state condition for unemployment. So Pissarides basically in his Econometrica paper said that decomposition is a log linearization or a linearization here of changes, accounting for changes in U due to changes in S, which I'm going to allow to change because they do change from month to month. And F changes a lot more because we know that. Right? Okay, so you can see from his picture that both are kind of important, and they move in the same cyclical direction. So in upturns, F goes up and S goes down, and vice versa. Okay, so if you look at those, the orange is the separation rate, but it's not perfect. It's not perfect by any means, but you expect in a period of structural change, S would be rising, and maybe F would be rising as well, because maybe job opportunities are rising in other sectors where workers are losing their jobs, like coal miners can't be hired immediately in the electric car vehicle sector, but maybe demand is there. But in general, the cyclical inspiration of the last model would be, in bad times you separate and it's harder to find a job. The finding rate goes down. That kind of makes the unemployment rate really cyclical. So Pizarrides basically said, that's a fact. And if we go back to my old-fashioned model in the beginning of time, when I first started working on this in the 1980s, he said, well, the model gives us some pretty strong predictions about the relationship between vacancies and wages and unemployment. So again, this is from our first lecture. It's literally, but it's from his econometric paper. He just puts it out there. It's the zero, first he writes down kind of a continuation. He calls it a Bellman equation. It's a bit loose, but it's the continuation value for a firm posting a vacancy. You have to pay for the vacancy. That's minus C. And then you have this Q, which is our notation, the probability of getting a worker in the job. That would be, wow, get J, but I already had V because it was posting, so, right? And then J is the same thing, and he uses the same notation, not an accident. I'm trying to make life easy for you. And then if you have zero profit condition or zero net worth of a vacancy posted because it's free entry, then you end up getting the last condition. So you see how a relationship between productivity, the wage, the discount factor is constant, S is also constant in this baby model, and you've got C, which is the cost of posting a vacancy, and then you've got this Q function. So we've got this relationship between wages and theta. Theta goes up, what happens to wages? Remember? Yeah, because labor markets are tighter, workers have more of a better fallback position, and it makes sense and it fits the data really well. In labor markets that are tight, workers get better wage deals. The question is how much? And the critique of Pizarrides, or the critique of Scheimer, was that wages don't move enough in the data to account for this. Because this is Nash share wage bargaining, and the wage in the Nash bargaining moves a lot. When productivity is better, the worker gets a piece of the action automatically, unless the worker really has no bargaining power. So you really have to put the screws in the worker to get the wages not to move much in the classic Pizarrides model. So this was the weakness of his original paper. Pizarrides' 2009 paper is a reaction to it. He's trying to defend himself because he kind of thinks he's got a chance of getting the Nobel Prize, so he better do a decent job explaining why I can still get the wage to be kind of rigid in my model. I just have to play with it a little bit. You had a question? Okay, yeah, so, I have to go a little bit faster now, but I like this paper a lot. It's a bit harder because you have to really read it carefully. There's a lot of subtle stuff going on there, and he doesn't derive everything clearly because he just doesn't feel like he has to anymore. So you have to do it yourself, but it's doable. So you've got this, these three ways that productivity shocks or productivity of workers can affect the wage, and two have to do with the sharing. There's a direct effect from the sharing, and then there's the fallback positions for the worker and the firm can be affected. So all those three are potential mechanisms that are not so strong in every version of this model. So it depends on the parameterization, how you choose to set it up. And he goes on to explain how the wage equation looks. And look, that's our wage equations, right? I love it, right? That's what you have to learn for the exam. It's exactly the same. It's the same equation, okay? And this is taken literally from his paper, from Econometrica, 2009. Now, he says, okay, I admit this is a problem because the wage is too flexible in my model with Nash bargaining. And he said, well, there are little tweaks you can fix the model with. And one tweak was, I'm going to assume that Nash sharing only holds for the new jobs. And once you get a job, you kind of get stuck in it. So think of the two-state model of employment. One is you have a flexible wage, and the other is I'm stuck. Right, like me, I'm stuck here at the Humboldt University. I'm never going to leave this place until they carry me out. And that's kind of the Pissarides trick. So he has a state with some probability you become a rigid, stuck person, and as long as you're not, and again, it's just a way of showing. I don't think it's supposed to be like the explanation of all wage relationships, but it does explain why, at least on the face of it, why new workers and new jobs have flexible wages, and wages can move a lot, but at some point you get kind of calcified, and then you get stuck. You can still lose your job, and you have to go back into unemployment and start all over again, but this is enough to get the ball rolling, to make wages rigid relative on the aggregate to, because the aggregate is what you can look at. I can't look and see if you have a rigid wage or a flexible wage. Okay, so, and he basically boils it down to this elasticity. This is the elasticity of the wage with respect to this labor market tightness. And he shows that all we have to do is kind of, we can play with the model. I mean, Scheimer had the idea of making, other people have had the idea of making productivity and wages move in a smaller band, or make wages kind of restricted, and that would already kind of mechanically make wages rigid. It's kind of cheating, but it works. Or you make the workers' bargaining power very low. Eta is not the same parameter. I think we use beta instead of eta, but I didn't. I wasn't going to change his text because it's too much. The idea is to somehow manipulate this elasticity. And he shows, and this is the coolest part of this paper, I think, in the end he shows that by adding a fixed cost of hiring, you can already make the wage a little bit less flexible. So that this is the modified wage elasticity, which has this H in it, and it's the same H that we talked about. This, if you meet a worker in the bathtub, you have to pay H if you want to hire them, right? It's just a cost of maybe training, and that's enough. If you make that big enough, you can make the elasticity of the wage with respect to theta smaller, and then you can solve the Scheimer problem. Okay? You got a question? No. You had a question, sorry.
Yeah, it's just like, is hold-up problems are analyzed in this context?
It could in principle lead to macroeconomic effects. So the idea is we both realize that there's a change in the bargaining set, and one guy says, the thing is, you have to do a hold-up, you have to have some credible way of enforcing the threat, I guess, right? And I'm not, one is to have a union where you can shut down the firm. You can have a strike. Okay, so that's kind of a hold-up. That would have, and
The bargaining problem,
yeah.
it's natural to it. I mean, should we enforce it somehow? I mean,
There are certainly ways to tell a story that would make it enforceable, or make it. Well, let's think about it. I mean, the threat of non-cooperation is like, I'm going to withhold my, in this model, the worker and the firm always agree on whether they should dissolve the match or not. So I think the hold-up problem is kind of already absorbed by this fallback position, I mean, strictly speaking. But there are more complicated ways to set the model up. So I think there are versions of this model that Pissarides appeals to with holdout wars of attrition, sort of different discount rates, so you can postpone. You can just say, well, I'll see you next week. We come back again, and the more desperate guy is getting more desperate, so he's more likely to yield. Everything's mutual here. Okay, so I have a few minutes. I'd like to talk about my own research. So this is an older paper, but probably one of the better ones that I've written with my first PhD student. And the idea was simply could we account for this rigidity of wages, which we need here, to solve the Scheimer problem? We need to get that elasticity of the wage with respect to the matching to the labor market tightness. We need it to go down. We need it to squeeze that. So we thought maybe, especially in Europe, we have these very large social insurance sectors. So Germany takes about a third of your WL, it takes it away. So you never see it. Either your employer gives it to the government or you give it to the government. It's a wash, it doesn't really matter, you don't get to see it. And in the Netherlands, it's even higher. In Sweden, it's higher. We're talking like a third. I'll show you the picture. So this must have a macro effect, right? Because the employer is paying 100 and you're only seeing 66. And maybe that is not a constant third. Maybe it actually moves. So maybe the fraction that you have to give to that you don't get from your employer may have cyclical behavior. Because what is it doing? What is this 1/3 doing? It's huge in Germany, but it's even bigger in some other countries like the Netherlands, like, depending on your perspective, Denmark or Sweden. So it's paying for social insurance. It's paying for your health. So you don't have to, in America, you have to save for in China, you have to save for your own, but in Germany, they take care of you. If you want the Rolls-Royce version, you can pay for that yourself, but that's a lot. Then you've got pension, pay as you go. You're paying for your parents, basically. And then maybe you're even paying into a fund. That's in Sweden, you pay into a fund, but still taking your money, right? And you have no choice. You can't say no. And then you've got, what else do we have? Think of Bismarck.
Health insurance.
Unemployment insurance, which is not insignificant. Now things are very good in Germany, but in bad times, and someone's got to pay for it. And what else? Pflegeversicherung, right? Old age care, whatever it's called. Old age disability insurance. All these things add up, right? Big time. So we thought maybe a little bit of action there could help. And maybe it's cyclical. How could it be cyclical? Well, effective payroll taxation can be state contingent. So in good times, the government doesn't need that much money because there's a lot of Y times P, PY, or in Pissarides' model, P, real productivity. And therefore, there's a lot, at a given tax rate, you get more income, so you don't need, in fact, in Germany, they have to reduce the contribution rate if they make too much money. So the only reason you get a tax cut in Germany is if the economy is doing really well and the Social Security fund is just overflowing with money, then often, I'll show you, they actually cut the tax rate. So that's a counter-cyclical. And you know, it's funny, they do it in the United States too. In good times, the Social Security take is adjusted by adjusting the ceiling, the tax max, or changing the rate. Okay, so this turns out to be a way of getting the wage to do what we want. We want the wage to be the gross cost of labor to the employer. We want it to be smoother than the business cycle. That's enough. And we can add search and matching. So back when we started writing this paper, there's a lot of discussion, big deal, many ways to get the wage to behave properly. Some don't work, and usually they don't work because the Beveridge curve doesn't work anymore. Unemployment and vacancies go in opposite directions, remember? That's one of the reasons why theta is so volatile, is because in booms, V goes up and U goes down. But in some of these models cited here, they actually go in the same direction. So those cannot be a good description of reality. One of the strongest things we have in macro is the Beveridge curve, right? It's not to say that it never goes, the curve never shifts. It's actually the dominant movement is always in the negative direction, or the high vacancies, low unemployment, and vice versa. Okay, so here's just some facts. Payroll taxes are high. So even in the United States, where taxes, people act like they don't exist, they do, but they're really high in Germany and Sweden, about a third. So I kind of exaggerated with Denmark, but it's because a lot of their contributions are measured differently. But overall in the OECD, we're talking about 10% of GDP, and in some countries it's even higher. And the reason why is because it's like the bandit problem. If you want to tax something, you go where you can actually find it. And in the old days, they used to tax imports because it was easy to see the ships coming in, you just tax it, right? And it's harder now with immaterial goods, with internet, et cetera. But if you see somebody employing somebody else, it's a sitting duck. Even in the United States, you always go to the employer and say, hey, where's my cut? You know, that's my holdup problem. And it turns out that even in the United States, payroll taxes are high. So even though the income tax rate is relatively low, and here's some data in our paper we showed this pretty convincingly, and that this tau, this payroll tax rate, is actually rising over the years. Since the oil crisis, it rose. So when you do that, you increase the burden to employers. So if you raise and why would you increase the tau? Because unemployment was rising, right? Unemployment is high, you need to raise more money to pay for those unemployed people. They don't pay for themselves. If you want to give them benefits, you got to raise taxes. But the tax rate does go down. And why is that in Greek? That's very interesting. Well, last time I presented this paper was in Greece. In any case, I'll fix that. It's because I copied and pasted these slides, and Microsoft Word is not capable of.
Do you speak Greek?
Yeah, fluently. Anyway.
But I think this is like an English translation.
Of course it is.
Yeah, I can read it.
It's payroll.
Yeah, it's payroll.
I didn't do this on purpose, but it's pretty funny. Okay, so you can see that the source is OECD, sort of. Kai. Okay, but in any case, the point of this is Germany, and Germany gives us the proof that in response to the crises, tau went up. The first oil crisis, second oil crisis, German reunification. So West Germans paid for the East German unemployment. And that increases the cost of labor to West German employers. And that means that unemployment is probably going to go up, ceteris paribus, labor demand will go down. And then you can see the Hartz reforms, and if you extend this, it goes even further down. Germany is in good shape now because labor is too cheap, probably. Workers are, this thing is exploding, and employers complain they can't find any workers. Well, hello, it's probably because you're not paying them enough, right? So anyway, that's a really fascinating, and you can see there's cyclical aspects to that, and the cyclical aspects can be seen if you take an HP filter and look at it. So you can see it's really counter-cyclical. If you understand the Greek, you understand that it's counter-cyclical. Here's some data on the cyclicality. You can see all those negative signs mean that the HP correlations are negative. So the average tax rate on the payroll is negatively correlated with GDP. Good times, low taxes. Bad times, high taxes. So that's kind of what we drove the paper on. And this even works for the United States. It's really cool. Now you could say maybe it's trivial, maybe there's some spurious correlation, third factors. We worked really hard on this. We got it published in a good journal, Journal of European Economic Association, so we're very proud of it. We show that you can set up a Morton's Pissarides model embedded in the RBC without any money to make this work. Okay, so yeah, if you're interested, you can read these slides. But the point is, it's basically everything you've learned in this course. So we have a Q. It's the negative function of theta. And it's based on a constant returns matching function. So you have the transition equation that we talked about. So employment is a function of separations. That's the second term in the last equation, plus vacancies times the matching rate. Okay, so it's a simple, and this is the cool part of the paper. We have this social insurance system, big tau, hits the wage bill, that's WH, and has to redistribute it to the workers, right? And I'm going to finish in a second, don't worry. This is fun. This is kind of like making my day. 'Cause I haven't talked about this paper for about 5 years now, and I thought, well, it might be a good example, good example of research in the area. So this last equation is a key budget constraint for the government. The government has to raise taxes to pay the transfers. The transfers are pre-committed, but if there are fewer unemployed people, fewer transfers, fewer unemployment benefits. So we cut out the health insurance and the other stuff. That's a big sort of albatross. You have to pay for that anyway. It would affect the cyclical properties for sure, but this is just to make the mechanism very clear. So tau becomes endogenous. In booms, you can cut the tau. You can cut taxes. And the workers feel like they're still getting some wages because they pay less contributions. And you see that in Germany, right? I showed that already. So you set up the problem like Andolfatto and Merz. Here's the functional form. Same, we have some other bells and whistles like capital. We have capital stock, and we have capacity costs, just to make the model more cyclically behave more appropriately in a cyclical sense. So you have the first order conditions, like in Andolfatto, you have a couple of new things. He didn't have capacity utilization costs, but we have a Euler equation for the value of a vacancy, shadow value of vacancy, or shadow value of a new hire. That's what it is, really. Okay. So the shadow value of additional search, and it has this intertemporal aspect because if you know taxes are going to go down, you'll postpone some of your search to the point where labor becomes less expensive. So you get this endogenous propagation of the shock. That's what we look. It's like the holy grail of macro is to get more persistence, right? So we do that. Anyway, the rest is kind of straightforward. Firms are mechanical in this paper. They do what their firms do. They maximize profits, and they post vacancies as well. And yeah, the wages are determined by a Nash bargain. So even though we have a Nash bargain, the endogenous tax actually makes the outcome smoother. So the wage is less cyclical, and that's what we want. And that's what gives us this beautiful wage equation, which has this additional feature. Okay, so that's how we get the Pissarides effect. We get the wage to behave better. The rest I won't talk about. There's only one shock in this model. It's technology. So it's almost, we're tying our hands to get this effect, and we have to calibrate it, as you always do with macro models. So this is all very standard. And look what we get. This is the model without taxes. So this is the classic problem of the RBC model. And this is an impulse response with respect to productivity. And you can see that, it's not very persistent. It's kind of boring. The impact effect is the highest, and then it declines. And the wage share is actually going. It's also it moves in the right direction in the impact, but it doesn't have this sort of persistent countercyclical impact. And these are the other variables, the same problem. It's just not enough persistence. Now, we put it in, and of course, I wouldn't be talking about this if we didn't get it. So we get this nice, persistent, hump-shaped effect. So the effect builds up over many quarters. You have a real boom because what happens? You have a positive technology shock. The government has more revenue. Unemployment's falling. The government says, hey, we can cut the tax rate, cut the tax. That makes it even more interesting to hire workers. So you get the propagating mechanism, which is exactly what the data seem to be telling us. So vacancies move in the right direction, unemployment moves in the right direction. So you have the beverage curve working, and there's the proof right there. So this is pretty, I mean, in all modesty, I think pretty good outcome for a model that has no money and otherwise just a standard search and matching labor market. Okay, most importantly, we can hit the Scheimer number. So we can actually get vacancies and unemployment not only to be volatile and to obey the Beveridge relationship, but we get the ratio to move a lot more than the wage. The Scheimer critique was that the standard Pizarese model says that wages move too much and they make it less attractive for workers firms to post vacancies, and therefore they kind of damp down the thing. So here's the data for Germany. The Scheimer ratio, and Scheimer's ratio is the variance of, or the standard deviation of theta with respect to a standard deviation of the productivity in the data. And you can see that the number for Germany is 35. So it's even higher than the United States. So really volatile. And that was established by Jung and some other people from Mannheim at the time. So that's nothing new, but it works. And this is a fact for a lot of OECD countries. This Scheimer puzzle is a real issue. So if you want to make progress, you have to make theta a lot more volatile than productivity. And the model does it. So you can see it right there. Very proud of it. And with and without payroll tax. So it really is a payroll tax issue. And we claim that we can do the Scheimer puzzle. There you go. And we simulate the model just to make the point. There it is. And you can see without, it looks terrible, right? Obviously. So it's just a straw man, but just to show you how important it is to get this in the story. Okay. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things you can do. We showed that Sweden used to be like Germany, and then they moved to sort of a more Beveridge system. So instead of funding unemployment benefits using the Bismarck approach, they moved to a general revenue source funding of unemployment benefits. And that makes a difference. If you look at the second part of the table, you can see the sign of the correlation flips. So unlike Sweden before 1990 looked a lot like Germany. That same idea. And not surprisingly, Swedes had very high unemployment, but they also had very high volatility. And then they said, well, now we're gonna fund this out of general revenues. We're not going to monkey around with the payroll tax anymore, and the correlation actually becomes positive. Okay, so, and you can see how that changes the behavior at the end. And the U.S., it's the other way around. The U.S. has become more like Bismarck since the Republicans were in power, since the 1990s, and the correlation actually goes the other, looks more like Germany. That was really, I think that helped get the paper published. We actually showed that this is true for the United States, not just for Europe, even though the United States doesn't look like Germany. Okay, I think I'm done. If you want, you can take a look at these slides. But it turns out that this is another way to make wages behave the way we want to. You know, it's not the only way, but it's something we should pay attention to. Okay, so any questions about the exam? Yeah.
Can we bring a paper with notes on it, or is it nothing
You don't need that.
on the back?
Come with your heads. It's just an encumbrance. I mean, usually when you say you can take in one sheet, and people write this microscopic, they invest more time doing that than they actually do thinking about the model. So, the best solution is to go to Tomas's section, pay attention, look at the notes he's generated, and look at the slides. You'll do fine. Okay? And tell all the people who show up to the exam, it's a shame they didn't come and have so much fun, because they didn't get to see this lecture either, right? Okay. Good. Well, good luck. I'll see you around.